from the heart of Dubai, where tomorrow is being built today, to the world. Welcome to the CTO Show with Mehmet. Here, we redefine technology and reimagine possibilities. With Mehmet, delve into the riveting realms of AI, cybersecurity, and digital technology. Experience the thrilling highs and lows of startups. Immerse yourself in the spirit of entrepreneurship and witness the future of business innovation being written in real time. Now, without further ado, let's tune in and explore the future.
Hello and welcome back to a new episode of the CTO Show with Mehmet. Today, I'm very pleased joining me, Craig McLuckie. He is the founder and CEO of Stacklok. We're gonna talk today about a topic which is, I think, very, very important in the world of AI and development in AI automation. We talk a lot about also security. We talk about how to control the environment, and this is exactly what me and Craig will discuss today. So without further ado, Craig, a little bit about you, your background, your journey, and you have a very rich journey, just as a teaser to the audience. And then we're gonna deep dive immediately in what we're gonna talk about. So the floor is yours, Craig.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. Let me just introduce myself quickly. So I'm Craig McLuckie, the founder and CEO of Stacklok. And by way of background, I've been in distributed systems pretty much my whole career. I started my career at Microsoft and went to work at Google, where I worked on what became known as Google Compute Engine, kind of Google's entry into the infrastructure as a service space, and really kind of that sort of pivot towards more of an enterprise software company. I then got the chance to work on what became known as Kubernetes. So started that project with a couple of my friends inside Google. And obviously that worked out pretty well. A lot of folks use Kubernetes out there in the wild. And it is interesting to see it becoming an anchor technology for a lot of the infrastructure management for AI tech. I started the Cloud Native Computing Foundation as a home for Kubernetes and to support incubation, innovation, open source. Built a company, sold that company to VMware, where I worked on what was known as the Tanzu portfolio. And then I stepped out and started Stacklok, which is hopefully what we'll get to talk about today, which is really an organization that's focused on bringing the capabilities that enterprise need to be able to bridge agentic and assistive technologies to their existing world of IT systems.
Great, and thank you again, Craig, for being here with me today. I'm gonna start kind of from your background relating to what you're currently doing. So you mentioned Agentic AI, and it's now, I remember in 2024, with the start of generative AI, and then 2025, we started to talk about, Agentic AI and how it's gonna take us to the next level. So when you look today at what's happening with AI agents, do you feel, it's history repeating itself when the same adoption, because, you started the Kubernetes and the Cloud Foundation. And so are we, and now we talk about MCPs and all this stuff. So are we kind of repeating the history again?
I always joke that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. I think it is reminiscent of some of these kind of big epoch transitions, right? Like I got to work on a .com during the .com era, like very early in my career. I got to see client server technology start to take hold. Got to be a participant in the kind of cloud journey, building cloud technologies and cloud native technologies with Kubernetes. It certainly does feel like an epoch boundary, but if anything, I would say it's happening a lot quicker. And the promise is significantly more disruptive than anything I've seen. Like, I think this is actually a pretty profound moment for technologists. I think if you look back at humanity, we've defined our kind of epochs by the dominant technology. There was the Stone Age and the Iron Age and the Industrial Age and the Digital Age. And I do think we're kind of entering into the AI age. So I think it is reminiscent, but I think it's far more significant in many ways than anything we've seen before. Because at the end of the day, it's just a new class of capability, right? Like it's a way to, like everything we've built to date has been built on kind of distributed system foundations and some new ways of passing messages or persisting data to disk. And this is just a whole new class of technology that just creates entirely new capabilities. And I think that the impact will be profound. I think a lot of people overestimate the impact in the short horizon with something like this, but perhaps underestimate the impact on the longer horizon. So reminiscent, but I think far more significant.
Right. Now, I want to jump in, to what you do today, Craig, but I'm gonna relate a little bit to, to your background also a little bit. So if I want to see the landscape of how we are deploying these agents, so of course, we talk about MCPs, right? And I gotta, which is like the model context protocol. So what kind of problems, MCPs were aimed to solve, but what are like some of the, I would say, issues that they came up? And I'm asking you this question in a similarity to when we started. I come from a infrastructure background as well, so like every new technology that comes, we try to solve what was a bottleneck before, but after a while we figure out like we need another management layer. So walk us through, what's happening in this field today, and where the need from to come up with a Stacklok to solve this problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you start looking at what the promise of agents are, right? Like it's effectively a system that can take data and turn it into knowledge, and then can take knowledge and turn it into action, right? So in the most simplistic terms, when you kind of break it down to the most fundamentals, it's a way to take data in a variety of different sources and turn it into something that has kind of distilled awareness around it, which is what we think of as knowledge. And then based on that knowledge, you can actually make decisions, and then you turn those decisions into actions. And an action could be filing a ticket, initiating a transaction. There's pretty much anything on the back end of it. And so the real challenge that I think organizations face is that question of how do you take data and turn it into knowledge? And the window, the gateway between kind of data and knowledge is the context window with LLMs. That's really what needs to be navigated. I think of it as a context real estate management problem. And it's not about just kind of grabbing a whole bunch of data and dumping it into the context window. It's really about organizing it and presenting it in a way that it's going to produce the best possible results. And so I think that's kind of problem one, which is, how does a real world enterprise turn data into knowledge via the context window and provide access in real time to those cluster of systems? And we've certainly seen these patterns around, RAG becoming very popular, which was really a way to take data and turn it into parameterized data that could be kind of augmented into the flow. But it quickly falls apart when you're dealing with real-time systems. So it's really about like that real-time access to the data that businesses are using. And that obviously introduces a whole bunch of kind of challenges around, this data exists in systems that are regulated or controlled or are sensitive. And how do you start to create the right controls to be able to access that from an authentication, authorization, auditability, traceability perspective? But also, how do you start to massage that data and present it in a way that actually supports the workflows that these systems need to be effective? And then the second part is turning that knowledge into action. What are the appropriate set of controls? How do you start to structure these systems so that an agent, which is a stochastic process, right? Like it's just like a person. It's valuable, right? Like it's amazing, but it's valuable. How do you start to create the right controls there? So I really think of it as this bridge that needs to exist. The reality is enterprises exist in this world where the people, the process, and the technology are deeply intertwined. It's very difficult to separate those things out. And it's naive to assume that an enterprise is just going to rip and refit everything it has. So the question is, how do you start bringing these technologies in? And MCP has emerged as a wonderful enabler, right? Like when I encountered the protocol for the first time, I was like, wow, this is kind of like the days, like I remember seeing Docker for the first time when, I'd been working on technologies like Kubernetes, and I was like, wow, that's just amazing, the useful thing to have where you can start to package things up and reuse them, et cetera. And I think like the protocol itself is very similar, like a natural language framework to describe things in a way that models can process them, and a natural way to expose tools in a way that models can understand and exercise them. But the real work starts in terms of operationalizing and navigating that in the real world.
Right. Now, the question, Craig, do the rush of adopting AI in general and deploying agents also cause this kind of issues? Because I never saw a technology before, and correct me if I'm wrong, like you're more expert than me in this, but I never seen a rush to deploy these technologies as what happened with agents, right, and in AI in general. um and do you see like companies sometimes are doing kind of trade-offs between security, maybe architecture, to just get the things deployed? How are you seeing these trends in the enterprise today?
Oh yeah, it's kind of crazy because I think I've never seen a technology where there's as strong a level of board mandates to embrace the technology, right? Like, so a lot of the organizations I've talked to, um, engineering teams are being metriced on how quickly they can adopt the technology. Like, I've very seldom seen this before in my career, where the goal isn't just kind of like you always think about, like, hey, you're a CTO, what do you care about? Or you're a CIO, what do you care about? Right? Like, I want to make money, I want to save money, or I want to mitigate risk. It's one of those three things.
Right.
And a lot of folks are looking at this as a way to both kind of make money, save money, and that mitigating risks part of it is not necessarily being addressed. And like, here's a funny statistic. Like, we did this analysis quite recently, and we were just looking at the rate of growth. So AI adoption and AI spend is outpacing any technology we've ever seen ever, right? Like, it's the fastest growing technology category in the history of humanity. And the interesting thing is the only thing that is growing at a rate faster than AI spend is the number of vulnerabilities that are being kind of exploited in an organization, right? So you look at organizations that have embraced an MCP technology, 20% of them report breaches, like security breaches, as a result of the technology. You see a lot of folks out there in the wild, like if you look at the number of MCP servers that have been published, there's something like 30,000 MCP servers that have been published. There's 450 GitHub MCP servers. And if you actually dig into it, about 1,000 of those are malicious, but which ones? And how would you know? And the problem that I think is this unbearable tension that a lot of organizations are feeling. They feel this acute need to be able to embrace these technologies because they see it as a critical differentiator, competitive differentiator. Like, there will be haves and have-nots. There will be winners and losers in the space. And so every organization is racing to be a winner, but they don't have the skills, they don't have the controls, and a lot of people are getting hurt. Like, I see a lot of people getting hurt right now because they don't understand the new challenges associated with it. They're throwing the tools into the teams. There's a lot of shadow AI use happening, and a lot of sort of exploits are being kind of targeted at developers that are NPX running
Right.
a random package off the internet that's actually malicious or has a supply chain vulnerability in it, or what have you.
Right. Craig, like if we want to stay in the security, perspective,
Yeah,
so
security's great.
what should be worrying for us the most? Is it like the data leakage? Is it like unauthorized actions? Because we're giving also authorization for these agents to do some actions sometimes, or is it like the hallucination? The context of like they can just uh come up with something which is nonsense, and then give it to the other agent, and then again start to do nonsense. So what should be worrying for us the most among these?
I mean, I think the root of a lot of the challenges that we face right now is that the reflexive position of the CISO is to push the responsibility or the accountability onto the individual that's using AI, right? Like, it's a very comfortable and convenient thing to do because you can basically say, hey, what I'm going to do is just treat any of these AI tools. So, hey, we build hey, we bought Cursor licenses, for instance, or we bought Cloud Code licenses, or we bought whatever licenses. We've trained our developers around security best practices. We're just going to treat the agents that are being built and run by developers to support their coding activities as developers, right? And we're going to push the onus of responsibility onto the developers. We're going to leverage our existing systems for, how we authenticate, how we authorize, how we reason about role-based access control, all of that. We're just going to treat those agents as the developers that initiated them. And things fall apart pretty quickly there, right? Because when you're a developer using these tools, you get trained to go accept. And like you look at like how many people out there are, kind of like joking about, hey, kind of one of these coding assistants, RMRF my root directory, and like ha ha ha. But what you're really seeing is this numbing where people are not good, like developers are not good, and like no one like they're great at developing code. They're not great at kind of moment to moment watching something and making sure it doesn't do something dumb, right? And so I think that the starting point is if you start to just treat these systems as human actors, you're going to get hurt, and you really do need to start reasoning about like how do I start to bound access to something, to a specific task. Like I'll give you a good example. Like right now, Amazon produced this MCP server, the AWS MCP server, which they've done a great job, right? So it's a pretty high surface area MCP server. They recognize, the AWS surface is so vast, it's very difficult for an open source project to kind of track it in accurate terms. And when you start using tools, tool pollution is a real problem. So they built a single endpoint that enables the developer to integrate it in, and there's the totality of the AWS surface area that they can use. Everything that they are authorized to see, the agent that's running with their credentials can now see. That could be very dangerous, right? Like you just think about like, okay, there's this thing that's doing work. It's being sort of watched by a developer, but the developer's getting numb to just pressing accept, because
Yes.
if 99% of the time it does the right thing, then 1%, and you see it work 99% of the time, you just stop thinking because you just assume it's right. You're not looking for that 1% moment where it's going to do something dumb in your AWS space. So simple question: how would you set that up so that it has read-only access? Like how do you actually start to implement a system so that if your developers are using this in agentic mode, it's read-only access, and then additional controls are in place when it's actually manipulating your resources, changing your cloud configuration. And so that is an area where I think a lot of people are going to get hurt in the short horizon by not taking the time to step back, assess how these workflows need to run, understand what capabilities need to be put in place. Not just like, you can't pinball between this like thou shalt not with developers, right? Like they will find a way to do what they want to do. So you really have to balance unlocking them with the tools that they want to use that are actually going to enable them to do the job better, with the controls that you need to have in place so that you're not going to get hurt as these systems perform. So that's one category. There's obviously a lot of different categories, like whole new classes of security vulnerabilities. Prompt injection via tool calling. Like there's oceans and oceans of new vulnerabilities that are being discovered and exploited at a time when organizations don't have a really robust understanding of the technology. So I'm not here to kind of call doom and gloom. I think there's some very practical things organizations can do to both unlock the productivity of these tools, but also establish the controls that you need in place to be able to put these things to work. But it does take thought and investment.
Right. Craig, you talk in that context. I when doing the research, you said like we should treat agents, we should make AI agents, senior developers, not interns, right? And this is going back to all the things that you just mentioned, and how us as humans, we should give some, probably context. We need to do now how we can enhance this from our side, because do you think and this may be a human nature, because we assume that it's a machine, like it should be like smart enough to do the thing, and then we remove ourselves from the loop and then we keep it. So how much involvement should stay from us, the seniors in that life cycle? And here I'm talking about even like the development part also as well. And where should I be focusing today if I am probably maybe a VP engineering, CTO, and I want to guide my team on how to try as much as possible to let these agents fail? So where I should be focusing more? Is it about supervision? Is it about um, making judgments, so not giving the full autonomy and keep myself as a human in the loop? What's your say?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we've certainly been running our own surveys around developer productivity with these tools in place, and it's fascinating because like you go speak to a VP of engineering, you basically ask them the question like, how much more productive is your team with these tools? And it's kind of, you'll get a lot of different answers. And I think, people want to be perceived as being effective at deploying and engaging these tools. But in a relatively naive manner, based on our own analysis, when you just throw a bunch of coding assistant tools into a team and just tell them to use them, you don't see productivity gains. Right? Actually, you see productivity declines, right? Because a lot of these basic anti-patterns that start to emerge, right? You look at the amount of time it takes to merge a PR, and you look at the size of PRs, the amount of time it takes to merge, and the sort of throughput of feature delivery. In many cases, it actually declines because, hey, there's a developer that's producing a 10,000 line vibe coded PR, and they're basically just pushing the owners onto their teammates to go through the review cycle to actually turn that into qualified code. Their teammates, have to sign off, during kind of code review on the work product. It kind of slows things down, in many cases. So I think, stepping back, the thing I keep coming back to is this is a fundamentally new class of system. Like this is like just the way that it works, the way that it operates is stochastic by nature, right? And so the way that we develop needs to change, right? Like it's not like, traditional distributed systems development where you establish a set of patterns, you define a set of use cases. Use cases become the proof of correctness. You start building the system. You make sure that the unit tests become the proof of correctness. You build the system, you run the unit test, everything works fine. You figure out where the scaling and contention points are, and you go from there. That's not how these systems work, right? You have to start with like, what does the model understand? Not just know, but understand. How does it start to produce work, and how can I start to create evaluation cycles to make sure that it's operating, within the boundaries of what I expect. And so, one of the things that I see is, like you need to start reasoning about the compartmentalization and the deconstruction of the workflow that the development team has put. So let's just, if we go back to like using these tools for code development, one of the things that I think has got a lot of airtime recently is things like SpecKit, which is basically just a set of prompts that provide a guided path for an agent to start participating in the development workflow. And the reason that that's so powerful is that someone actually went down and wrote down the workflow, like a priori. They sat down and described what the workflow is. They deconstructed into a set of steps. They described when operator or human participation is involved in the steps. And you started to be able to reason about that workflow in a way that is very kind of AI native. And so I think for organizations that are starting to embrace these technologies, it really isn't just about like, hey, let's just kind of throw these technologies out there and see what sticks. You really need to start reasoning about the workflow, deconstruct into smaller consumable pieces, and then figure out how to run evaluations so that you actually are asserting that something is working as it should for a specific task. Make sure that it's operating within the characteristics that you want to see, and then set up controls. So for instance, like, in the engineering cycle, one of the things that we've been doing inside Stacklok is start to get a lot more formal around our planning cycle. Like, this is what planning looks like. These are the resources that are produced. These are canonical examples of, a use case or this or that. This is where all of our conversations with our clients are being archived. So as we start going through the planning cycle, we can formally describe the workflow, and then we can start to describe a lot of the artifacts as assets that support the workflow. We can build an MCP server or something like that to vend it, and it creates a lot more structure. And so you're able to start. In the case of our development flow, we're not necessarily running eval cycles around development flow, but what we are doing is observing our productivity at each step of the game, and we're reasoning about is this increasing productivity, is it decreasing? Where are hallucinations getting into our specifications? What additional scrutiny is required? Can we use these systems to kind of, run their own internal evals against the work product to make sure that we identify these gaps? And so just being very disciplined in terms of workflow definition, compartmentalization, and then reasoning about execution against smaller tasks, and then stepping back over time once the system is working is kind of key to success.
I think, Craig, this also, correct me if I'm wrong, and feel free to add anything. So what you just described also, I believe, helps organization, the enterprise, to implement these guardrails in a better way. Because when you dissect, the processes that you're doing, I believe you would have a better idea where today actually maybe you have like shortcomings in the context of where might authorization is implemented in the wrong way, where the data leakage might happen because you don't have the proper security measures. And
Yeah.
then now, when you try to make it like in an AI agent perspective, so automatically you're kind of implementing the best practices. Can I think about it this way?
I think so. And I think it's a question of, it's really about what platform investments are you making? Like, where are them? Like, and I think a lot of enterprises really struggle with this. And like when you look at the projects that are out there in the wild, one of the most commonly cited challenges that organizations have in readiness technologies is the state of the art is changing so quickly, right? So you're like, okay, we're going to build an agent to support, kind of client service, like, custom support. And so we pick a model, and then we start to structure these things, and we build a workflow, and we do all of this. And by the time we've done, the state of the art has changed completely, right? Like you just go and, like a new frontier model's come out that's, 3 times better at this. And it invalidates a lot of your assumptions around factoring. And you get caught in this sort of treadmill of this sort of ever increasing capability. And so I think starting and looking at the systems that are the slowest changing, and kind of working out from there, right? So, and this is why something like MCP is such a great story, is that, hey, I've got all these systems that I need to integrate with. Let's just figure out a way to start formally defining those integration points. Let's get to a point where we can authenticate and authorize, but not necessarily using an open-ended credential that an admin has or an operator has, but like a de-scoped credential that can be identified as that agent that has access to only the resources that are necessary to support that workflow. And then as you start to perform the work, maybe you discover that, hey, additional, access is required. Have a way for it to start, kind of escalating the privilege of the system as you start to pursue. Having the ability to just have auditability and traceability, like what systems is this touching? When did I touch it? Like, like, oh, something went bad. How do I go back and sort of debug and diagnose that? And starting, at the interfaces to the existing systems and kind of working out from there is helpful. And like this might be a bit of a deconstructionist perspective, but I see a lot of organizations worrying about like, agentic orchestration and relatively complex structures at a time when most organizations are going to be very well served by just having access to a frontier model and some kick-ass tools, and being able to wrap that up in a relatively minimal way will probably produce better results than, and even if it doesn't produce those better results right now, I guarantee in 6 months, it will produce better results than anything that you can produce using kind of like a more complex orchestrated system using, reflection patterns and, kind of, self-analysis, right? Like the frontier models are advancing at such a rate that starting with a very, very simplistic system, which is just, hey, here's a set of tools. They're relatively constrained. This limits these frontier models to, the set of resources that are germane to the task. We've got the right controls in place. We've got the right visibility in place. We've got the right auth in, auth C. We can now start to create real value. Is going to produce better results for almost everyone.
Craig, on that, do you think this is one of the reasons why we see some, and there were a lot of reports coming out in 2025 about like, AI initiatives failing. So do you think this is one of the reasons why after successful demos and promising, roadmaps, we have not achieved the ROI that we thought about? So, and if there's any other also as well, and how I can make, what would we call them, proof of concepts, successful durable systems building on agentic AI?
Well, I mean, part of the problem is people don't understand how they work, right? So it's one thing to get a POC working, but it's a whole nother thing to get a production system working. And it's one thing to get something working. It's another thing to keep it working. And I think a lot of the problems that people have is they're not investing in how you have to change how you build, right? Like right now, TDD, test-driven development, pretty popular. Like, hey, write down the unit tests, code to those tests, get it running, and it runs. Unit tests aren't proof of correctness for AI models. It's evals. And these are stochastic models, right? Like it's probabilistic by nature. It's just taking a bunch of kind of input context, in the context window, and it's basically doing a lookup against embeddings, and it's producing the most likely response to that input. Now, obviously, as that input changes, the output's going to change. As the embeddings change, the output's going to change. Like these, it's not a system where you can just put it together and walk away and expect it to continue to work. Unless you are running constant evals, unless you're constantly observing and assessing the behavior of the system, any additional form of entropy, any noise coming into the system is going to impact its behavior. It's going to impact its operating characteristics. So, hey, you've got an MCP server. It works great. You add another MCP server. It works okay. You add another MCP server. And you've discovered like, hey, I've just saturated my context window with spurious tool descriptions, which completely degrade the performance of the system that I'm trying to build. And if you're adding those things at runtime, into a production system, forget about it. You have to be able to establish those controls. So I think the starting point is just you have to change how you work. You have to start with this kind of, like I always like to ask people that we interact with them, like, what eval framework are you using? They're like, eval framework? I'm like, if you're not running evals against like an agentic system, if you're not looking at that as the way that you both get to a point of evidence, if you don't have the ability to generate synthetic training data or just sample training data that you can use to kind of prove the correctness of the system as you're building, you're gonna have a very hard time. And so I think first is really just changing the way you think about building and embracing this kind of what I think of as like kind of eval-driven development or spec-driven development, and using the eval framework as a proof of correctness. The second thing is context is hard, right? Like a lot of people have been struggling to just render context. Now, context isn't data. Like it needs to be presented in a way that has the highest relevance to the task at hand. So I'll give you an example. Like if you're a developer working on GIS, like adding mapping features to your application, feature means something. It's a collection of vectors that describe some topographical element that's made. When you're interacting with that, feature means something else to almost every other developer in the world. It's something that you're working on. Like, how do you contextualize it? Like, how do you describe that this is a feature which means these things? And so, just dropping a spec in, dropping a document in that has, feature X without additional markup that actually contextualizes what feature means over here is going to produce bad results. And so that sort of second big kind of gap I think of is the context chasm. Like, how do you go from just grabbing data and actually turning it into the most valuable context real estate you can through a variety of techniques? Like, there's a lot of different ways to start to reason about turning data into context. And that's another area that I don't think organizations are investing enough in. And so between those two, I think that results in a lot of the challenges that organizations see in terms of going from POC to prod use of agents.
Great. Craig, I'm gonna ask you, your solution, you decided to make it also ToolHive. It's called ToolHive, right? Free and
ToolHive.
open source. Of course, you have the enterprise version. How much, the background you came from, from Kubernetes and Cloud Native Foundation, how this has, affected the decision? And have you felt that there will be a kind of a counterbalance of power in the AI area? So, how much this affected, the decision to open source the solution in a
Yeah, I mean, it's not surprising. When I was building Kubernetes, I think a lot of folks inside Google thought I was crazy wanting to open source something that, like Google had a lot of IP, intellectual property around,
Right.
and some of those technologies, and taking a lot of that knowledge and distilling it out into an open source technology that we were effectively giving the community wasn't obvious to a lot of people when we did it. There were a lot of discussions around why it made sense to do that. And for me, I think it really comes down to a couple of things. Like, I believe that a platform needs to exist in the space. Like, I really believe that, enterprises need a platform that enable them to connect agents to their existing systems, both in terms of rendering context and asserting control. And I believe that, over time, open source platforms tend to outperform proprietary platforms. Like, that just seems to be like, but when you look at the world out there, there's an open source alternative to every proprietary technologies, Linux to Windows, Kubernetes to, a lot of the sort of proprietary alternatives, or even those were open source, but there was single vendor open source. And so I think, open source and community-centric open source drives differentiated results. For me, I'm a startup. I've got some great engineers. We're working really hard, but we would certainly benefit from having other organizations participate in this platform building exercise. So, we've been talking to Red Hat. Red Hat is helping us build ToolHive. I think, ToolHive is probably the only open source MCP platform that has external maintainers on it. It's not a single vendor initiative. Red Hat feels as much ownership of this as we do. When the time is right and we find the right foundation, we'll look to bring the core runtime into a foundation. And by doing that, we get a lot of value. It's not just about, hey, there's extra engineers. Like, those Red Hat people are really smart. They understand enterprise. They understand what the challenges are. They're working in the space. They bring their own perspectives, and they make it better because of who they are. And as we've kind of been looking at the use of ToolHive, there's a lot of other organizations out there that are starting to embrace it. Like we find, kind of every other day we have a conversation where there's some new exciting West Coast tech company that's adopted ToolHive and is using it, and they want something in the community, or they want whatever. And so if you're building a platform, having it built in an open source core just creates a far more rapid path to engagement and adoption. And I don't feel like Stacklok has to own this. It's not our intent to own the platform story. Like, we want to create value around it. We want it to become ubiquitous. We want everyone to embrace it. And by starting with kind of community-centric open source core, we have a better opportunity to create something that will have a Kubernetes-like durability than just another flash in the pan,
Right.
AI startup.
Right. Greg, like you mentioned about your team. So compared to how you built engineering teams before and how you build engineering teams today. So in this age of AI, like what skills are becoming less important, and which ones are non-negotiable when building your team today?
It's interesting. And it's, when you start looking at the space, there's definitely this process of becoming AI capable, AI aware, kind of AI sort of maximalist, if you will. Like, there's a change in mindset. There's this growing awareness of how to deploy these tools. Like, there's an inordinate amount of emphasis on context engineering versus systems engineering. Like this nominal idea that knowing, understanding what these models understand, not just what they know, and how to kind of start to contextualize it is important. But I think that's something that can be learned, right? Like, it's not something that it's like you have it or you don't have it. Like, being an expert in context engineering is something that you can grow over time. And I think it's a lot easier to teach a great engineer that has really strong engineering foundations, fundamentals, that has excellent attention to detail, that has, kind of deep sophistication, that's able to reason about relatively complex systems and how they interact, that has experience with those class of systems to become, an expert in context engineering. But the one thing that I think is, you have to be AI curious, right? Like this, I think the thing that is that sort of there's these kind of two hard lines for me. Like, one hard line is you have to be a great engineer by the way I think about a great engineer. So being able to actually see the systems, understand the patterns, reason about the deconstruction of the problem to smaller pieces, execute against that with attention to detail, like that you continue to have. But this new thing is you have to be AI curious. Like, I don't know how to better describe it, but if you're an engineer that just delights in writing code by hand and you just want to sit in a room and produce beautiful code by hand, you're not going to have a job in 5 years. Like code is going to become IO. It's going to become like bytecode over time. We're not there yet. Don't get me wrong. Like, we still got a way to go, but like, we're not seeing the asymptotic convergence of these systems in terms of their production of code. Like, how you work is going to have to change. Like, this sort of agonizing around the specification, like reimagining yourself as a context engineer, where the thing you're building is still an engineering system, right? Like, the work product is still code, but the place where you're creating value is in the context engineering space, not in the actual manipulation of code by hand space. And so I think that kind of natural curiosity and that willingness to embrace these new systems it's essential. If you don't have that curiosity, you're going to get left behind, and you're going to have a hard time, because if all you love doing is turning a specification a PM hands you into beautiful code, I'm telling you now, these things will do it in 3 years, and it's going to be tough.
How that change for leaders, Craig? Like how this will affect the way you evaluate the team? Like it's different. The metrics are different than before, right?
The metrics are different. And it's interesting because there's really two sides to this, right? Like, obviously you want the team to continue to execute, right? So you want to reason about, and look, different, like I'm not going to every engineering leader has a different way of reasoning about the throughput rating. Some people use feature points, there's a set of heuristics. Every engineering manager has their own sort of favorites. And so you want to maintain that continuity. And I think it's, like I said earlier, it's dangerous to just like throw cursor or cloud code or something in there, right, without any structure, and assume that you're just going to get better results. You're not. Like your engineers are going to stumble. And so the second part of it is really what investments, what named investments are you making around building your own operational capabilities? Like what set of things are you as an engineering leader earmarking to change how your team works, right? So it's also, and you have to maintain velocity, but you also need to make sure that you're earmarking specific things. And so, one of the things, like we've just run this as a series, initially a series of experiments. Like, let's just build something for our own use. So we built a knowledge server, silly example, but we basically, wanted to make sure that every engineer had access to the best information at any moment, and that could be exposed as an MCP tool into their workflows, so that if you're using these tools, you can ask questions like, what major issues are the community encountering, what's so-and-so working on, etc. So basically just a canonization of the knowledge that a team has. And we went ahead and built that, and we operationalized it, and we now expose that to all of our teams. It changes how managers work, right? Like I no longer have to go to my engineering leaders and ask them what someone's doing. I can just ask that question of the knowledge management tool. It's got all of the engineering docs and the GitHub issues and all of that indexed and chunked and available by semantic search. So it's increasing our ability to, the span of control for an individual manager can now be a lot higher, because, we've now made that investment in a tool that actually uplifts our own productivity. And we've worked at becoming expert at that. So it wasn't, we could have just gone bought Lean or some other technology that does the same thing. But if we'd done that, we wouldn't have learned what it takes to produce that. We wouldn't know why initially our Discord messages weren't being, weren't showing up as well as our Google Docs, because there just wasn't, our chunking quanta was too large, and there just wasn't enough semantic payload, when we were indexing one of those Discord messages versus the bigger things. And so that sort of structured investment in kind of improving your capabilities, and then just, observing it, like, are people using it? Like, and keep, just badgering, like, why aren't people using this? Like, what, what's wrong with it? Like, why is it not part of your flow? And it quickly gets you to that second point where you start to identify, like, why is so-and-so not using this? You got to have an authentic conversation. And like, if it's because they're not AI curious, that's going to be a problem. If it's because it's not performing as expected, well, that's a different problem. And you go fix that. You go, just kind of work the flywheel. And so, yeah, we like for us, it's really about, rethinking a lot of our practices, like getting much, much, much more formal in terms of how we do planning, because, hey, these tools are really good at data processing. Like, can we start to, take it, spec kit doesn't work for us because we're an organization that's operating at a certain scale. Can we reimagine that in a way that aligns with our own practices? Can we start to introduce the tools and start to create the rituals around the use of these tools so that we become far more productive and actually increases our throughputs? So I don't know if that answers the question, but
yes, absolutely, Craig. Craig, like, very quickly, do you think 2026 we will see it as the year of the mass adoption of agents, agentic AI, and MCPs?
I think 2026 will be the year where folks get their training wheels on, right? Like, I'm not going to predict the singularity and like all of a sudden everything goes swimming. I'm also not a doom and gloom merchant. I mean, I think we are at a point where there will be a correction, like in terms of how people think about it. But I think 2026 will be the year when organizations start to build enough awareness around what works, where we've had enough time to start, like, hey, the right linguistics, frameworks will start to emerge. People start talking about eval first development or spec-driven development or, a lot of the patterns. I think people will start to be able to generate the awareness of where things are falling down. I think people will start to get to a point where they are, like it's about getting over that energy curve. Like, when you're building a fusion reactor, you're putting enough energy in that it starts to produce actual energy. I think 2026 will be the year where we start to see real material energy return in certain kind of use cases. And I think it's an area where there will be a bit of a correction, like some of the shine will rub off. And I think it'll, like the way I start to describe it is more mainstream engagement, less hype. People will work through some of the disappointments that people are having. But we will actually start to see the patterns and start to, I expect to see over the next year, the 12 factors of AI native, apps, some bright spark's going to write that paper and everyone's going to climb all over it and we'll harden it and that'll become part of the kind of lexicon. And, we will start to see kind of normalization. I don't think it's the year where we're just going to see sort of asymptotic breakout. I don't think we're going to displace 30% of, our resources with agents. But I do think we're going to, at least by the end of the year, most enterprises will have built something that they can look at. They understand it works. They understand why it works. They understand how to keep it working. They understand how to connect it into the existing systems. They'll have the right controls in place and they'll feel pretty good about it.
Great. As we are coming to an end, very traditional question, Craig, for you, where people can get in touch and learn more.
Well, you can always look me up on LinkedIn or visit stacklok.com. That's STACKLOK.com. And we'd love to hear from you. Or jump onto our community Discord, which is linked from our website, or check out the open source repo. We'd love to hear from you.
Great. Thank you so much, Craig, for the time today. All the links you just mentioned, they will be available in the show notes. So people, they don't have to look for that. You'll find every single link in the show notes. And again, Craig, I can't thank you enough, for sharing the time. I know how busy it can get, especially for someone like yourself. So I appreciate it. And this is how I end my episodes. This is for the audience. We are of course, we recorded this in 2025, posting this in 2026. So happy New Year for everyone. And I wish you had a very good, holiday season. And as I say always, if you just discovered us by luck, thank you for passing by. Share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. And if you are one of the people who are followers, fans for the show, thank you very much for the support previous years and in this year also as well. I hope we can do great results together. And as I say always, stay tuned for a new episode very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Hit that subscribe button, share the show with your tech-savvy friends and fellow entrepreneurs, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. Your support means the world to us.